They said he could hear a heartbeat from a mile away. They said his shadow moved on its own, that the trees leaned from him as if he were winter given a body. They said the Vampire King had once emptied a city in a single night, and that the fog still remembered. In my village, children learned his name the way they learned fire, something you respect because you do not understand it, something you do not touch. Mothers spoke of him in low voices while kneading bread, as if a careless syllable might drift across the hills and find him. Men hung bundles of dried hawthorn over doorways and pretended the gesture was practical, the way people pretend when they are afraid. Yet the truth was that most of us had never seen him. We only lived in the long reach of his mountain. On nights when the moon lay thin as a cut nail, a pale mist would slide down from the northern cliffs. Wolves that had been bold the day before would not come near the pens. Travellers, if any dared the road, would make camp far from the old stone markers and keep their eyes on the dark line of pines. In those hours the world felt hushed, not as if it were being hunted, but as if it were listening. The first time I heard him, I didn't know it was him. I only knew that somewhere beyond the ridge, something ancient exhaled, a sound like wind passing through an empty hall. It made the candle flame on my table tremble, and my hands went cold around my cup. My name is Elowen. I was 19 that winter, old enough to be sent out on errands for the apothecary, young enough to still believe that fear could be negotiated with good sense. My grandmother had been a singer in her youth, before our village tightened into itself with superstition. She taught me old lullabies that didn't belong to any church and hymns that never had words written down. Songs are doors, she used to say, not to magic, to people. I did not expect I would ever need a door like that. It began with a sickness in the orchard. The frost came early. The apples hardened on the branches as if the trees had forgotten how to let go. Then, without warning, a strange warmth rolled through for 3 days. Buds swelled when they should not have, bees stirred and died. When the cold returned, it took the confused life with it. Bark split. Sap bled pale and thin. The orchard smelled wrong, like green wood left too long in water. The elders blamed a curse. Someone spat and said the mountain had grown hungry. We had little enough, and in a village where every winter was a careful accounting, a failed orchard was more than a tragedy. It was a slow narrowing of options. One night the apothecary called me to her back room. She had a letter sealed in grey wax, the mark on it not a crest but a simple circle with a line through it, like an eclipse. "This came from the monastery," she said. "The brothers won't speak of it, but it is for the mountain." My stomach tightened. For him. She nodded once. Her eyes, usually sharp with instruction, were tired. "They say the king is fading." It sounded absurd. Things like him did not fade. They ended the way storms ended when they decided to. But the letter was real in my hands, heavier than paper should have been. The seal was not cold, it felt like skin. "Why us?" I asked, and my voice betrayed me with its thinness. "Because you sing," she said quietly, and when I looked up she was watching me as if she wanted to memorize my face. "And because you are kind enough to go where others won't." Kindness in our village was a word people used when they meant foolishness. I wanted to say no. I wanted to put the letter down and walk out and return to tasks that made sense, drying herbs, measuring tinctures, mending cracked jars. But all winter I had watched parents decide which child would have the last of the oatcakes. I had watched the orchard's broken branches scrape the sky like pleading hands. I had watched my grandmother shiver in her sleep and pretend she wasn't cold. So I took the letter, and before dawn I wrapped myself in wool and stepped onto the road that led toward the mountain. The air was still, muffled by snow. My boots crunched softly as if the world were trying not to wake something. There were no birds. Even the river, half frozen, made no sound under its skin of ice. I walked for hours past the last farmstead and the last shrine with its cracked statue of a saint whose face had worn away. As the day dimmed, the pines thickened. The mist was there, a pale thread weaving among trunks. It was not cold mist. It was the kind that made your lungs feel too small. At the old stone markers, I stopped. Everyone stopped there. They were set in a circle, half buried, each carved with symbols that looked like prayers that had been rubbed and rewritten too many times. A shape stood on the far side of the circle. At first I thought it was a deer, Then it shifted, and I saw it was a man in a dark cloak with the hood down, hair silvered like frost. He did not step into the circle. He did not raise his hands. He simply waited as if he had been there long before I arrived. My throat went dry. "I don't mean harm," I said, because it was all I could think of that sounded like truth. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "No one comes here meaning harm, they come meaning need." It was not the voice I had imagined for a monster. It was a voice that sounded used, worn smooth by too many nights of silence. "I have a letter," I managed, "from the monastery." He looked at the wax seal and something flickered across his expression. Not surprise, not anger, something like recognition that hurt. "You are Elowen," he said. I stared. "How do you?" "I hear names the way you hear songs," he said, as if it were an ordinary sense. "They carry." He did not reach for the letter. He did not step closer. The space between us felt deliberate, a boundary he respected more than I did. Finally, he inclined his head toward the trees. "Come," he said, "before night makes you afraid of your own thoughts." He turned without waiting to see if I followed. I did. The path was not a path. It was a suggestion, a place where branches had been bent aside by something passing often but lightly. The pines gave way to stone. The mountain rose in tiers, its cliff faces dark and slick with meltwater. I expected a castle, jagged and dramatic as the stories, but what emerged from the mist was quieter, a long, low structure built into the rock, as if it had been grown rather than raised. Pale stone, weathered smooth. Narrow windows that did not gape like mouths, but watched like eyes that had learned patience. No torches burned, yet I could see. We entered through a door that opened without a sound. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and something older, paper perhaps and time. He led me down a corridor lined with shelves. Not weapons, books, scrolls, bundles of dried herbs hanging like the ones in the apothecary's shop. A basin of water, clean and clear, with a cloth folded beside it. "You expected a dungeon," he said quietly, and I realized he had been listening not only to my footsteps. "I didn't know what to expect," I admitted. "That is the kindest way to approach anything," he said, and the softness of the sentence made my chest ache. He brought me to a room where a hearth sat cold, unlit, but the stone around it held a ghost of warmth. A table stood near the wall with a cup already set out, as if he had prepared for company long before he decided to allow it. He took the letter at last. His fingers were pale, but they did not look like claws. They looked like hands that had held many things carefully. He broke the seal and read without moving except for his eyes. I watched him trying to reconcile the man before me with the stories. This was the feared king, Varin they called him in whispers, the unlit crown, the bloodless winter, names that tasted like superstition. When he finished, he folded the letter with precise care and set it down. "They want me to return what I took," he said. "What did you take?" I asked. He hesitated, and in that small pause I felt the weight of centuries. "Nothing that belonged to me," he said finally. "A debt, perhaps, or the right to rest." I did not understand, but I had come with another purpose, one my own heart had quietly carried. "They said you are fading," I said. "Is it true?" His gaze lifted to mine. In it there was no hunger. There was something else, an exhaustion so deep it had become calm. "Yes," he said, "I am thinning, the old bonds fray. The world changes, it is not cruelty, it is simply time." I found myself stepping forward despite every lesson of fear. "And the monastery sent me because I sing," I said, feeling foolish as soon as the words left my mouth. "I don't know how that could help." A faint smile touched his mouth, not amused but tender in a distant way. "Songs are doors," he said. My grandmother's phrase landed between us like a shared secret. "You knew her," I whispered. He nodded once. "She came here when she was young, she was not afraid of me, she was angry at me for being alone." I couldn't picture my grandmother angry at anyone, but I could picture her refusing to let a lonely thing remain lonely. "What did you do?" I asked, and my voice was careful because I did not want to accuse him and I did not want to flatter him. I wanted only to know. He looked past me as if seeing the mountain through the walls. I did what I could, he said. When the southern lords hunted your people in the old war, I took their scouts and sent them in circles until they forgot where they were. When plague came down the river, I stood in the cold water night after night, and held it back with roots and stones so it could not flood the lowlands. When the wolves grew bold, I led them away. My mind stumbled. Those were the stories too, but in the village they were told as curses, as warnings. The lost scouts were said to have been lured by a demon. The river's strange calm was said to be unnatural, a sign of a dark bargain. The wolves that vanished were said to have been eaten by the king. You could have let us suffer, I said. No one would have known. I would have known, he replied simply. The room felt suddenly too small for what he was saying. Kindness done unseen had a certain heaviness to it, like carrying water in your hands without spilling and without being thanked. And what does the monastery want? I asked. He touched the letter, not looking at it now. They fear what happens when I am gone, he said. They fear the old wards will fail, that what lies deeper in the mountain will wake. They fear the hunger that comes after a guardian dies. You're a guardian, I said, and the word surprised me. I was made to be, he said. Not born, made. A long time ago people feared the dark places. They chose a man and broke him and bound him to the mountain and called it salvation. The sincerity of it was worse than any horror, not because it was gruesome, but because it was quiet. Because it sounded like the way villages made decisions when they were desperate and wanted someone else to carry the cost. And now they fear you, I murmured. They fear what they needed, he said. I thought of the hawthorn over our doors, of how we thanked our safety by spitting at the name of the thing that had kept it. My throat tightened. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked, though I knew the answer already, felt it in the shape of his restraint. Because protection that demands gratitude is not protection, he said. It is trade. He stood then, slow, as if standing took effort. You came for a reason beyond a letter, he said. I swallowed. I heard you, I said. Before I knew who you were, I heard you, like someone breathing in an empty place. His eyes softened. Yes, he said, it is the sound of the bond loosening, the mountain is quieting me. What do you want? I asked, truly. For the first time, something like vulnerability showed, an openness that felt dangerous, not to me but to him. I want to rest, he said, but I cannot. If I rest, the wards fail. And if the wards fail, people who never once spoke my name kindly will be harmed. He said it without bitterness. That was what broke me. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the small tin of honey cakes my grandmother had insisted I take. I set it on the table like an offering, not to a king, but to someone who had forgotten simple comforts. His gaze flicked to it, and then away, as if he did not trust himself to want it. Will you sing? He asked, and his voice was so gentle it barely disturbed the air. Yes, I said, though fear still lived in my bones, but I don't know what song would. The one your grandmother sang, he said, the one without words. I closed my eyes and searched for it. It had been a melody she hummed when she thought no one was listening, a string of notes like a hand smoothing hair back from a fevered forehead. I had never asked where it came from. It had always felt older than any question. I began softly. The room changed, not in light, not in shape, but in feeling. As if the air which had held itself carefully around him allowed itself to move. The notes rose and fell like slow breathing. I did not sing loudly. I did not try to impress. I let the song be what it was, a door. When I opened my eyes, Varin had lowered himself to sit on the stone bench by the hearth. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, as if he were offering something unseen. The silence between phrases felt important. I let it be. As I sang, I noticed small things. A crack in the wall near the floor had been packed with moss and clay, repaired by someone who cared about drafts. A bowl of dried berries sat on a shelf, untouched. A cloak folded neatly over a chair as if someone expected to use it again. He listened like a man listening not to entertainment but to permission. After a while the air in the room warmed, not from fire, but as if the stone itself remembered sunlight. The cold that had clung to my fingers eased. Varin's shoulders, which had held a tension I hadn't seen at first, loosened by degrees. His eyes closed. And then, so quietly I almost missed it, he breathed in, a fuller breath than before, as if the song had found a place in him that still knew how to hold life. I stopped singing without meaning to, startled by my own sudden hope. His eyes opened. They were dark, yes, but not empty. They held a glimmer like deep water catching a distant star. "It helps," he said, and the words were simple, almost disbelieving. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "Then I'll keep singing," I said. A sound came from beyond the corridor, a dull thud, then another. Not footsteps, too heavy, too certain. Varin's head turned. He went very still. "Someone followed you," he said, not accusing, just stating the shape of the world. My stomach dropped. "No," I whispered, "I had been careful. I had looked back on the road, I had seen nothing." "They did not follow you," he corrected. "They followed the idea of you. Fear has its own scent." The thuds came again, closer. A voice echoed faintly, distorted by stone, calling out words I couldn't make out. I stood shaking. "If they're here, They will do what frightened people do when they believe they are being brave," Varin said. "Stay behind me." I should have run. Every story told me to flee the mountain when armed men approached, but my feet would not move away from him. He rose, and for a moment the room seemed to grow taller, the shadows lengthening not in threat but in readiness. He moved toward the corridor with the calm of someone stepping into rain. At the doorway to the hall, the first of them appeared, 3 men in travel-worn cloaks, faces tight with purpose, carrying iron charms and bundles of hawthorn. Behind them, a monk in grey robes, his hands clenched around a wooden symbol, eyes bright with fear he had dressed up as righteousness. When they saw Varin, they froze. Their courage faltered, and I saw then that their hatred had always been borrowed from stories. Reality was harder to hold. "There he is," one man whispered, voice cracking. "The king." The monk's gaze snapped to me. "Girl," he hissed, as if I had betrayed him personally, "step away from that creature." Creature, the word fell into the hall like ash. Varin did not move toward them. He did not bare teeth. He only stood between them and the room where my song still lingered, as if he were shielding something fragile. "I have not harmed her," he said. The monk's hands shook. "You have enchanted her," he said. "You've used her voice to bind yourself again. You should have died as the wards decreed. We came to end this properly." "End this properly." I looked at the monk, at the men behind him, and I understood with a cold clarity. They did not want me dead because I had done wrong. They wanted me dead because I had complicated a simple story. If I lived, if I spoke, the village might have to hold 2 truths at once, that the feared king was not what they said, and that their fear had been a kind of cruelty. People would rather destroy a witness than reshape their beliefs. My knees went weak. Varin's voice, when it came, was very soft. "She is under my protection," he said. The men swallowed. One of them lifted his hand as if to raise an iron charm, then faltered when Varin's gaze met his. There was no threat in it, only a depth that made the man feel seen in a way he did not want. "She's a village girl," another muttered, trying to bolster himself. "She doesn't know." "She knows," Varin said. A silence. The monk's face tightened. "You've been a shadow on this land for centuries," he said, voice rising. "Feeding, lurking, stealing." "No," Varin interrupted, and there was no anger in it, only exhaustion. "I have guarded. I have carried your fear so you could sleep." The monk's eyes flashed. "You want praise for it." Varin's gaze flicked toward me just once, and in that glance I saw something like a decision being made. "I want nothing," he said. "Not praise, not forgiveness, not even understanding." He stepped forward then, not toward the men but toward the threshold where the carved stone markers, symbols, had been set into the floor. He placed his bare palm on the mark of the eclipse. The air seemed to tighten, as if the mountain itself had held its breath for centuries and was waiting for his signal. "I will go," he said, "not into death, into sleep, deep enough that your wards may settle, deep enough that you will not dream of me." The monk's mouth opened, startled by the ease of it, the lack of bargaining. "But the girl," one of the men began, eyes darting to me with something like guilt. "She will leave," Varin said, "unharmed, and you will not follow her." The monk's jaw worked. How can we trust you? Varin's smile was faint and sad. You cannot, he said, but you will. He lifted his hand from the stone. The symbols under his palm seemed for a heartbeat to glow, not with light but with meaning. The mountain answered in a low, deep hum that vibrated through my bones, not frightening but steady like a great heart. The men stumbled back instinctively, not because something attacked them, but because the space itself asked them to make room. Varin turned to me, his voice dropped so only I could hear. Elowen, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a blessing and an apology at once. Your song gave me breath. I will use it to do what I should have done long ago. Rest, I whispered, and the word felt like grief. Release, he corrected gently. There is a difference. My eyes burned. But you'll be alone, I said, because it was the most human fear I could name. He looked at me with that deep-water gaze. I have been alone for a very long time, he said. Tonight, for the first time, I was not. I didn't know what to say to that. There are some truths that your throat cannot shape without breaking. The monk spoke again harsher. Enough of this, come girl, before. Before what? Before kindness became inconvenient. I stepped forward, surprising myself, not to obey him, to stand beside Varin just for a moment so that the memory of it would be real. My grandmother sang here, I said, voice trembling but clear. And she came home and never spoke of it because she knew you would be hated for your help. She was wrong to keep silent. I won't be. The men looked at one another, discomfort rippling through their fear. It is one thing to hate a monster. It is another to hate a person standing in front of you, shaking, speaking in plain words. The monk's face went pale. You will not be believed. I don't need to be believed, I said, and realized it was true. I need to be honest. Varin's expression softened, and in it I saw a gratitude that asked nothing from me except that I continue being what I was. A door. He reached into his cloak and drew out something small. A ring, simple, made of dark metal that caught no light. He held it out. What is it? I asked. A mark, he said. Not of ownership, of witness. It will warm if danger comes near you. It will remind those with sense to step back. I took it with shaking fingers. It was cold at first, then, as it rested in my palm, it warmed to the temperature of my skin. You don't have to give me anything, I whispered. I know, he said, that is why I am giving it. Behind us the mountain's hum deepened. It felt like a lullaby played on stone. Varin turned away. He walked down a corridor that led not upward, not outward, but inward, toward the oldest parts of the mountain, where even the air seemed to have layers. At the mouth of that corridor he paused and looked back once more. Not at the monk, not at the men. At me. Sing when you can, he said softly, for those who are feared and for those who fear. Then he was gone into the deeper dark, not a dark of horror, but of earth, of rest, of things that do not need our permission to be. The mountain's hum settled into stillness. The air loosened. Somewhere far below, something vast shifted into sleep. The monk stood rigid, as if his certainty had been pulled out from under him. The men's faces were blank with confusion. They had come for a story of triumph, for proof that fear had been justified. Instead, they had been offered a quiet surrender that made them feel small. You will not speak of this, the monk said, though his voice lacked its earlier force. I will, I replied. He stepped closer, eyes hardening, and for a moment I thought he might try to take my voice the way frightened people take what they can't control. The ring in my hand warmed sharply. The monk faltered, his gaze dropping to it. Something like recognition crossed his face, an old memory perhaps of symbols he had studied without understanding. He stepped back as if the air itself had asked him to. Go, he said, and the words sounded like defeat, not mercy. I walked out of the mountain with my satchel light and my heart heavy. The sky outside had cleared. Stars hung over the pines like quiet lanterns. The mist had thinned. The air felt normal again, like a world that had been held gently and then set down. On the road home I saw tracks in the snow, wolves, many of them, but they angled away from the village as if guided. I saw where the river's edge had been reinforced with stones piled carefully, newly placed, to prevent spring melt from flooding the lowlands. No one would notice. They would only notice if the flood came, and it did not. At dawn, as I crested the last hill, I looked back at the mountain. It stood as it always had, indifferent in shape, but I felt under its silence a new kind of quiet. Not emptiness, peace. In the weeks that followed, the orchard did not miraculously bloom. Winter did not turn kind. Hunger still had to be managed, and fear still moved through the village like a draft under a door. People asked where I had gone. Some looked at me as if I were dangerous simply because I had walked into a story and returned. I told them the truth anyway, in small pieces. I spoke of books on shelves, of a basin of clean water, of repairs made to keep out cold. I spoke of wolves led away and rivers held back. I spoke of a man who had been made into something the world could blame, and who had carried that blame like a cloak so others could remain warm. Some scoffed, some listened too intently, as if hoping for scandal and finding instead something that required them to feel. My grandmother, when I told her, did not look surprised. She only reached for my hand and turned the ring gently, her thumb resting on its smooth metal. He rested, she whispered. He released, I corrected, and her eyes filled, not with sorrow alone but with relief. That spring the thaw came steady instead of sudden. The river rose, but it did not rage. The lowlands stayed dry. New buds appeared on the orchard trees, not many and not all at once, but enough that the apothecary smiled when she saw them, and enough that my grandmother hummed in the kitchen without realizing she was doing it. Sometimes at night, when the moon was thin and the village held its breath out of old habit, I would step outside and listen. No storm, no hungry silence. Only the wind in the pines, and beneath it, so faint I could have imagined it, the memory of a deep, even breath. People still speak of the vampire king, they still hang hawthorn. Fear is an old language and it does not forget easily. But now, when they say his name, I hear other things woven through it. A guardian. A kindness done without witness. A man who chose, in the end, to protect those who would never love him, and to let their hatred remain uncomplicated by his presence. And when I sing, quietly, while kneading bread or tending herbs or walking the road at dusk, I sing not to summon him back, not to bind him to us again, but to honor the gentle truth the world tried so hard not to see. That sometimes the darkest title belongs to the softest heart. And that true kindness can exist behind fear, silent, patient, and warm enough to keep an entire valley alive.